For those of you who don't know that last book of mine, The World Without Us, I actually wrote that because I wanted a world with us. The idea was this little thought experiment that theoretically wiped us off the map in order to show how quickly the Earth could heal and refill empty niches when relieved of the daily pressures that we heap on it. My hope was that readers, once they saw this picture of a newly restored, healthy planet, would be inspired to wonder if there might be some way that we could add ourselves back to the picture, only in harmony, not in constant combat with the rest of nature. But in trying to determine exactly what that nice natural balance might be, I ran into this troubling fact that every 4.5 days or less, we add 1 million more people to the planet, which didn't sound very sustainable to me. So at the end of that book, I unexpectedly tried, even to me, another thought experiment. I asked one of the world's most distinguished demographic institutes in Vienna to compute, all social implications aside, what would happen if we all participated in China's one-child policy. The surprising answer was that by the end of the century, we'd be back to about 1.6 billion, which was the population of the Earth at the beginning of the 20th century, before we doubled our numbers and then doubled again, for reasons I'll explain presently. But look, let's get serious. None of us wants to live, wants some government telling us what to do in our bedrooms or in our private lives. The nature part of human nature is to make copies of ourselves, as it is with every other organism. So instinctively, the idea of being forced by someone to put the brakes on what comes naturally is repellent. China's one-child policy, which was implemented in 1980, may be why there are 400 million fewer Chinese today than there would have been otherwise. But realistically, a draconian policy like that just isn't going to fly hardly anywhere else. And then there's the question of whether it even matters that every year we add all those people, which is the equivalent of 4 more Beijings or 10 more New York Cities. I know a lot of you saw an editorial in the Times about 10 days ago, as I heard from people everywhere, which argued exactly that, because it dealt precisely with this idea. It said it's no problem because the more people there are, the more human ingenuity we'll have to solve the problem of, for instance, how to feed more of us. Now, although that sounds like circular, if not downright magical thinking, a lot of pundits and economists believe that we can have our planet needed too. But the question that I left dangling at the end of The World Without Us: what is the sustainable capacity of this planet for our species, factoring in our consumptive behavior, etc.? That became one of the main talking points for that book. As one of my sources for this book points out, the population question is the intersection between natural science and social science. Actually, it's more like a collision between them. It's easy to grasp that in a national park, balance must be maintained between predators and prey, lest the ecosystem crash. But when we're talking about our own species, it gets harder. We're hardly objective about ourselves, and all kinds of religious and other vested interests get involved. Nevertheless, I was surprised by the overwhelming majority of readers, including some economists and priests, who were so grateful that I'd raised the issue. But it's such a loaded topic. It's fraught with conflicts between knowledge, instincts, emotions, beliefs. So finally I decided I really needed to examine this, not as an advocate or a foe of population management, and I could have said population control, but that in itself has become a loaded term, but examine it as a journalist, researching and weighing the facts from as many kinds of sources as possible. If this book seems thick, it's because the last 100 pages are mostly my bibliography. But I also needed to research on the ground. For one, population books sound depressing, or, as important as the topic may be, boring. It's sometimes said that demographers, those social scientists who track and interpret population trends, are accountants without a sense of humor, since they're not adding or subtracting mere shekels, but us. Now, unless you're an accountant yourself, uh, you don't find accounting to be entertaining reading. So I needed strong, evocative, irresistible stories as well as deeply researched facts to make this book a compelling and worthwhile read. And as you heard, ultimately my research took me to 21 countries. And it boiled down to these four questions that I asked everywhere I went, starting in Israel and Palestine and ending in Iran. The questions were, number one, how many people can fit on this planet without tipping it over? Number two, the converse. How much nature do we have to preserve to ensure our own survival? Or can we possibly know which other species are essential to us before we wipe any more out? Three, is there anything in the histories or liturgies of the broad swath of our world's cultures, religions, nationalities, etc., that might possibly embrace the idea of, so to speak, refraining from embracing so much in times of crisis? And four, if the number is less than the nearly 11 billion that we're currently headed to by century's end, or even less than the 7.2 billion we're already at, is there a way to design an economy that doesn't depend on perpetual growth to prosper, so that we might gradually bring our numbers down to a healthy level and keep them there? More than one expert I interviewed said that these may be the most important questions on Earth, but invariably they added, they may be impossible to answer. As a journalist, my reply was, impossible or not, if these questions are the most important on Earth, we damn well better try. But, as I said, they're loaded, which is especially true when there are political and religious pressures to be fruitful and multiply, to build a mighty tribe or nation. I start this book by plunging directly into one of the hottest examples, Israel and Palestine, where extremes of both are bent on outpopulating each other in a land, most of which is a sandbox. There are ultra-Orthodox Jews having double-digit families in hopes of being the majority in the land, versus what was once called Yasser Arafat's biology bomb. The PLO's secret weapon, he used to say, was the Palestinian womb. Now, I began there because unless you're from parts of Asia or Africa where missionaries never made a dent, to a Jew or a Christian or Muslim alike, this is hallowed ground. It's a place that evokes powerful emotions in all of us. So I figured it might get people's attention. Now, back during the British Mandate, before the State of Israel was created in 1947, British ecologists calculated the carrying capacity of the Holy Land to be 3.5 million people. A founding Zionist, the first Israeli Prime Minister David Ben-Gurion, however, argued that Jewish ingenuity could make the desert bloom. He believed the land could hold twice that, 6 million. Today, there are 12 million jammed between the Mediterranean and the Jordan. And by the middle of this century, there will be 21 million, and a lot less water. Desalination plants are already running nonstop, and they're very coal intensive, and they produce more sea salt than Israel can sell as kosher salt. And you don't want to dump it all back in the sea because you might disrupt marine ecology. I met Israeli and Palestinian ecologists, water experts, demographers, who were all frightened about glowing numbers. Both a rabbi and a Quranic scholar cited the story of Noah, whom God told that in order to save the human race, he also had to save all the animals, because we can't have a world without them. But I also met the ultra-devout on either side who believe it's God's will to come out the winner in this demographic derby, and that God will provide for everyone. Ecologists sometimes talk about a so-called Netherlands fallacy, namely the fact that so many Dutch who live in Europe's most densely populated country have such a high standard of living. That's not proof, they say, that humans can thrive in essentially an unnatural artificial environment. In Israel, I heard it called technological optimism, that they can solve anything if they put their minds to it. But like all of us, though, both the Dutch and the Israelis need the things that only an ecosystem can provide. Fortunately, they can afford to purchase most of those things from somewhere else. The northern half of the Holy Land, by the way, where most Israelis live, is already nearly twice as densely packed as Holland. One ecologist who was also a Talmudic scholar cited the story of Joseph, who was born at a time when Israelites were polygamists for the same reason that Mormons were later on. It was a strategy to have many children so the tribe would grow quickly. But then Joseph correctly noted that a time of scarcity was imminent. One of 13 children himself, he confined himself to just one wife, 2 sons, and advised Egypt's pharaoh that it was time to conserve in order to save themselves, which they did. I have a modern example later in the book. Among the countries I visited that have discovered non-coercive, completely voluntary ways of bringing their population down is one that surprises a lot of people because it's a Muslim theocracy, and one that in this country is often portrayed as a charter member of the evil empire. The same year as its 1979 Islamic Revolution, Iran actually applied coercion in the opposite direction, charging every fertile female to do her patriotic duty and get pregnant, to help build a 20 million man army to fight off the invading Iraqis. By some estimates, at one point, Iran's growth rate peaked near the biological limits for fertile women, and the highest population increase the world had ever seen is what it achieved, 4.2%. Now, amid the horror that we hear these days about chemical weapons in Syria, occasionally somebody recalls that Saddam Hussein used them against his own Kurdish minority and then against Iran, which had this oil-rich province that he thought that he could seize easily because the new Islamic Republic was just barely organized, just like he did in Kuwait 10 years later. As many of you probably know, NATO supplied much of his armaments, including feedstock for his nerve gas. Without much sophisticated weapons technology, Iran simply responded with repeated waves of soldiers to hold Iraq to a stalemate for 8 years. And today, wherever you go there, you see these billboards filled with rows of pictures of locals who were among the millions that were martyred in that war. But once it was finally over, the director of Iran's budget office realized they had a big problem. He calculated the number of people that their shattered economy might reasonably support. All those males born to the 20 million man army would need jobs, and the chances for providing them shrank with each new birth. He and others met with the supreme leader to warn of the instability of a nation filled with frustrated, angry, under or unemployed young men. In short, a nation like today's Pakistan. So soon thereafter, the country that had told its females to all get pregnant for the good of the nation was posting banners across the road reading, "1 is good, 2 is enough." A new Ayatollah, he's still in power today, issued a fatwa saying that when wisdom dictates that you do not need more children, a vasectomy is permissible. A female OBGYN there told me what it was like being on the teams of doctors that went on horseback to health clinics to the remotest villages and later by 4-wheel drive and even helicopters, offering everything from condoms to pills to tubal ligations, all for free. But it was also voluntary. Everyone could choose the number of children they wanted. The only obligation was to attend premarital counseling, either in a mosque or in the health center, which is not a bad idea for anyone. In fact, American Quakers do that. Among the things discussed in those classes was how much does it cost to feed and care for and educate children. The other crucial part of Iran's family planning program was encouraging women to go to school, because they tend to postpone their childbearing until they complete their educations. In fact, everywhere I went, even in the poorest countries, female education is the most effective contraception of all. Because once a woman's out of school, she has something new and interesting to do with her life and a means to make a living for her family. Overwhelmingly, educated women tend to have 2 children or fewer. And in Iran, where today 60% of university students are female, the population growth came down to replacement rate a year faster than China. There's more to tell about my travels there, including the sad fact that while I was there, after 20 years of what the UN once called the most successful and humane family planning program on earth, the Ayatollah Khamenei suddenly rescinded it. At the time, I was meeting with Iran's oldest environmental NGO, which is also a women's organization, and they were furious. But I want to talk a little bit here about food, because it's one of the two reasons why the human race, after barely growing for the first 99+% of our existence, suddenly exploded in the 19th century, but mainly in the 20th. Population only increases in two ways. More people are born than die, or people live longer, so they're still hanging around when others are born. For much of human history, most babies didn't see their first birthday. About half were dead by their fifth. Since two people, one man and one woman, who produced two children essentially replaced themselves, the fact that population grew so slowly until about 2 centuries ago means that even though a woman might have 7 or 8, the average number of children who survived long enough to have kids themselves was barely more than 2. An average life expectancy was about 40 years. But then in 1798, Edward Jenner discovered a vaccine for smallpox, which used to knock back our numbers every year by the millions, which was then followed by other medical advances: more vaccinations, antiseptics, eradication of insects that carried epidemics, pasteurization of milk, and suddenly fewer were dying young and people were living longer. Now, none of us over 40 would ever argue that medical technology is a bad thing, because without it, most of us wouldn't be here. It's important to understand, though, that whenever we cure another disease, more people stay alive to beget more people. For years, Bill and Melinda Gates, like many others, have dedicated much time and money to eradicate diseases such as malaria and HIV. And if you've ever witnessed the ravages of either, you will pray that they succeed. But in recent years, the Gateses have come to realize that solving one problem would exacerbate another on a stressed and stretched planet. So now they're major funders of family planning. Because when there's too many of us, it's increasingly more complicated to keep ourselves and human civilization healthy. But an even more significant boost to our numbers than modern medical tech came from modern food technology. Just before World War II, two Germans, chemist Fritz Haber, engineer Karl Bosch, invented something that has changed the world arguably more than any other invention ever. That was a way to pull nitrogen from the air and apply it chemically to soils. Before the Haber-Bosch process, the amount of plant life on the planet was limited to what a relatively few species like legumes with roots that hosted nitrogen-fixing bacteria could contribute to the soil. Artificial nitrogen fertilizer derived from a double dose of fossil fuels, both as its feedstock and because it burns a lot of fuel to make the stuff, simply blew the lid off of what nature could do. Let me put it this way. More than 40% of us couldn't be here without it. Take away artificial fertilizer, our population would be little more than half what it is today. Small wonder that both these guys won Nobel Prizes. Well, to a certain extent, Fritz Haber mitigated the population spurt he unleashed by also inventing the mustard gas that Germany used in World War I. And a cyanide-based pesticide fumigant he created to use in grain storage was later refined by the Nazi chemist into Zyklon B, which is the gas used in extermination camps. And that was made in a factory that Karl Bosch headed. Now, both of them were fervent anti-Nazis, but they lost control of their creations. And some would argue that not only applies to nerve gas, but also to nitrogen fertilizer, which has downsides that we all know. Force-feeding our crops with chemicals sterilizes soils, fouls the downstream waters, kills off New Jersey-sized chunks of the ocean at the mouths of our world's rivers, and it emits a lot of nitrous oxide, which is the most potent greenhouse gas after CO2 and methane. Now, the Times op-ed that I mentioned earlier, it was called Overpopulation is Not the Problem. In it, geographer Earl Ellis of the University of Maryland in Baltimore asserted that there's no environmental reason for people to go hungry now or in the future. Our ancestors, he explained, devised stone tools, fire, finally agriculture to reshape ecosystems and provide us more sustenance. And ever since, we've constantly contrived new food technologies to sustain humans. Population growth itself, he argued, is the mother of invention, always stimulating us to coax more food from the land. Our planet's carrying capacity, he concluded, emerges from the capabilities of our social systems and our technologies, more than from environmental limits. Now, when I read that, I thought, wow, what a comfort that must be to the planet's more than 1 billion hungry people. Unfortunately, as Pope Benedict XVI acknowledged in a 2009 encyclical, our social services are doing an even lousier job than ever of sharing the bounty of the land. The Pope was particularly angered by a problem that maddens many people who are trying to help feed the world, that so much of this food, the food on this planet, is not actually grown to feed people but to make money. The fact that so much of our agricultural prowess is devoted to producing a commodity and not sustenance for all is why the commonly heard plea that we could feed everyone if only the harvests were distributed more equitably is unfortunately not very realistic. Nevertheless, Pope Benedict, like Ellis, contended, on this earth there's room for everybody through hard work and creativity. So in 2011, while I was researching this book, I visited the Vatican, went to the Pontifical Academy of Sciences, which, to the previous Pope's dismay, had warned in 1994 that it was now unthinkable to sustain indefinitely a birth rate of more than 2.3 children per couple. Demographic consequences would be unsustainable to the point of absurdity. Nevertheless, the Church still encourages population growth. If that's my wife, I'm not here. Thank you. Where, I asked the Academy's current director, would we get food for the nearly 10 billion by mid-century, with so many already malnourished? Wouldn't clearing more forests for farming be disastrous? Because beset by floods and erosion, China alone is spending $40 billion to put trees back. And force-feeding crops with chemistry is now backfiring on us in surprising ways. Well, the answer, I was told, would be through increased yields using new transgenic crops being designed at the centers of the Green Revolution. International Maize and Wheat Improvement Center in Texcoco, Mexico, and the International Rice Research Institute in the Philippines. Now, as I'm sure most of you know, in the 1960s, just as our burgeoning populations in the developing world were nearing the brink of famine, a miracle of genetic breeding occurred at those centers that more than doubled the world's grain harvest, in some cases up to tenfold. Green Revolution food technologies are often touted for debunking dire predictions of inevitable famines as population growth outpaces food production. Predictions made by economist Thomas Robert Malthus and his latter-day analogs, ecologists Paul and Ann Ehrlich, who wrote The Population Bomb. But when I went to both places, I met no food scientists there who agreed. Actually, they said, in Green Revolution founder Norman Borlaug's 1970 Nobel Peace Prize acceptance speech, he warned that his work had essentially bought the world just a generation of time or so to resolve overpopulation. There can be no permanent progress in the battle against hunger until the agencies that fight for increased food production and those that fight for population control unite in a common effort, Borlaug had concluded. So later, Norman Borlaug would be awarded the Congressional Gold Medal by the United States for having saved more lives than anyone in history. But he understood well the paradox of food. The more we produce, the more people don't die of starvation, and they live to beget more people that need to be fed. So until his death in 2009, Borlaug served on the boards of population groups because he'd seen that what Malthus had only theorized back in 1798 was coming true. Food production can't keep up with the very population growth it helps to produce. And as a result, we have those billion hungry people. And despite everybody's best efforts, it's likely to get worse. The first two places where the Green Revolution was tried were India and Pakistan. Both were saved from what seemed like certain famine, which Paul and Ann Ehrlich had predicted, unless, as they said in the preface to The Population Bomb, an agricultural miracle occurs. And then it did. But as a result, in about a decade, India will surpass China as the most populous nation on earth. and Pakistan's one of the fastest growing. Not to offend the wonderful people I met there, and also one of the most hopeful stories in my book is from Pakistan. But Pakistan's also one of the scariest places. Today it has 185 million people in a country much bigger than Texas, which has 26 million. By mid-century, if current growth continues apace, Pakistan will far outnumber today's United States. Projected 395 million, all on a land the size of Texas. And a significant portion of them are frustrated and angry, unemployed young men. Every day I was there, mayhem erupted, including several urban grenade battles. I lost one interview with two men who'd been saving Karachi's mangrove forests because the previous day they were found floating in the lagoon, tortured and murdered by the local timber mafia. Karachi Civil Hospital, whose entrance is also a police station. Armed guards are posted in the surgical theater lest warfare erupt in the triage units. Pakistan's waxing out of control, and it happens to be a nuclear power. In India, Dr. G.S. Kalkat, who's the head of the Punjab State Farm Commission and the man who directed the implementation of the Green Revolution in India back in the 60s, told me that India's three biggest problems are population, population, and population. 3 Sikh farmers I met in his office took me to their villages where I spent a day mostly interviewing widows of farmers who'd killed themselves because the levels in their 50-foot wells originally dug to water the Green Revolution crops now have dropped to 500 and even 1,000 feet, and they couldn't afford to keep drilling. According to figures from their farm union, corroborated by the Indian government, 270,000 Green Revolution Indian farmers have committed suicide since 1995, and overwhelmingly, the symbolic method of choice is by drinking pesticide, which must protect their laboratory-bred crops, which didn't evolve in nature. Half our people are sick from pesticides, heart attacks, high blood pressure, cancer, the farmers told me. Our kids have skin diseases and bad eyesight. No matter how much they eat, they're anemic. The teachers call them slow learners. And the fathers, all of them, 200,000 rupees in debt on every acre, are all suicides in waiting. We're all on each other's suicide lists, suicide watch lists. Well, today more than half the human race lives in cities, compared to only a third of us in 1950. Since kids in urban areas aren't an economic asset to parents like they are on farms, it's widely assumed that world population would level off around 9.2 billion by mid-century. But even though we're growing more slowly, there are already so many of us on this planet that just this past June, the UN Populations Division latest revision projects that our numbers will keep growing, hitting nearly 11 billion by the end of the century with no sure peak in sight. In the next 50 years, Norman Borlaug's successor at the Wheat Improvement Program told me, we need to produce as much food as has been consumed over our entire human history. They were trying, he said. Geneticists there and in the Philippines showed me what the Vatican was talking about, experiments to hot rod photosynthesis in hopes of increasing plant productivity up to 50% over previous Green Revolution yields, possibly even to give grains enough energy to fix their own nitrogen to minimize artificial fertilizer needs. But everyone acknowledged that even if they can do this, commercially viable enhanced photosynthesizing crops are at least 25 years away. And by then, there will be billions more of us. And agroengineers face another growing problem, spawned by growing populations. As ever more of us expel more carbon, our overloaded atmosphere overheats the planet. Grains have temperature thresholds. For every 1 degree centigrade of warming, harvests drop 10%. With our world now headed beyond a 2-degree increase at present emission rates, population will be up, food production down, irrigation water scarcer, and coastal dikes may have to protect much of the world's rice production, which is probably unaffordable. And also those rosy predictions that northern Canada and Siberia will be breadbaskets in a warmer world neglect that their conifer-covered acidic soils will take millennia to adapt to crops. Worldwide, about half of grain production is used for animal feed, and in the U.S., it's like 70%. Plus, there's the third of our corn that's fed to cars. Vegans constantly scream that we could feed everybody if we didn't do all that. But our species is omnivorous, and though a lot of us avoid eating hoofed creatures, as more people become urban and develop, the truth is that the demand for meat just keeps rising. So 2 years ago, Robert Goodland and Jeff Van Hong of the World Bank down the street totaled up the toll of livestock feed, livestock flatulence, forest-to-pasture loss, packaging, cooking, temperature, waste production, fluorocarbons used in meat refrigeration, carbon-intensive medical treatment of both livestock and of meat eaters who suffer from heart disease, cancer, diabetes, high blood pressure, and strokes, and even the cumulative CO2 exhaled by the world's 19 billion chickens, 1.6 billion cattle and water buffalo, 1 billion pigs, and 2 billion sheep and goats. Their conclusion was that livestock and their byproducts account for at least 51% of worldwide greenhouse emissions. Now, since you may be wondering, at one point in my book, I do look at the prospect for that vegan dream, test tube meat. But even artificial meat has to come from somewhere. So currently, there are experiments using things like blue-green algae, pig stem cells, and in Japan, human waste as feedstock. But just like jet-propelled photosynthesizers, the guess is that commercial viability is decades off. So with 40% of the terrestrial Earth that's not frozen now dedicated to feeding ourselves, everywhere I went, I spent a lot of time researching my second crucial question. How much nature do we need to preserve to assure our own viability? How will we know if we push something off this planet that we didn't realize we needed until it's too late? In Countdown, I go to Latin America and China, where ecologists in a worldwide effort called the Natural Capital Project have shown us something wonderful, that croplands closest to forests do much better than those farther away. In Costa Rica, coffee yields from bushes adjacent to rainforest have a 20% higher yield than plants a kilometer away because birds and bats and native bees and reptiles were pollinating and providing pest control. Conversely, a surprising number of species, not everything of course, a lot of large mammals have vanished, but a great many others nonetheless appear to be hanging on in ribbons of remaining forests and farmed landscapes. As pristine wilderness goes too fragmented to sustain everything, the Natural Capital Project colleagues believe that the future of biodiversity will be determined by what happens in agricultural countrysides across the Earth's tropics and temperate regions. In Nepal, where overpopulation is not just a human problem but a bovine problem, as cows are sacred and can't be killed, I saw an ingenious World Wildlife Fund funded old cows home that gave aging beasts a dignified final chapter rather than keep them working with an arthritis ointment that had proved toxic to 8 endangered species of vultures. Today, the cows get a proper Hindu funeral, and their untainted carcasses feed the newly replenished, thriving vulture populations. In the Philippines, surrounded by the world's most biologically richest seas, despite a national government that has long genuflected to the world's most conservative Catholic bishops, one Manila suburb now sends men to prison for 6 months if they buy condoms without a prescription. I saw their fishing villages take family planning into their own hand. They're coming to understand that if they want to keep fishing, the source of 90% of Filipino protein, by the way, they have to keep the number of fishermen in balance with feedstocks. In western Uganda, where tourists who pay to track mountain gorillas are the chief source of income, a young wildlife veterinarian discovered that the very humans who benefited were endangering that income because their diseases were passing to gorillas who share our DNA. To preserve them meant keeping the numbers of human in check, so family planning has become a critical component of environmental preservation. That veterinarian who founded the organization Conservation Through Public Health happens to just have walked into the room. This is Gladys Kalema Zikusoka from Uganda. Thank you for coming, Gladys. So, little story from the book. Across the water in Japan, across from the Philippines. The last wild oriental white stork had vanished in 1971. In 1989, a stork hatchery at Toyuka, which is an hour from Kyoto, successfully reproduced some storks using breeding pairs from Russia. But the local rice fields, soaked each year with organomercury pesticides, were too toxic for the fledgling birds to be released. 9 years later, a 10-year-old schoolgirl named Yuka Okada, heard that storks like those caged birds in Toyuka's hatchery had once filled the skies and nested in every chimney. And after learning why they no longer did, she went to the mayor and demanded that Toyuka serve organic rice for school lunches. To do that meant eliminating mercury, inviting back grasshoppers, but also making the rice paddies safe for storks. The mayor, upon hearing the simple truth from a 10-year-old, could only agree. His city slogan became, "An environment good for storks must be good for humans, too." The next plantings were pesticide-free. A year later, the first stork was released, and today, wherever they nest, the rice is twice as valuable because the presence of storks guarantees its purity. An economy that had bottomed was rejuvenated, and today tourists flock to Toyuka to watch hundreds of storks do the same. Now, is this just a little story about a luxury food, high-end organic rice? Actually not. This is a scenario that Japanese economist Akihiko Matsutani believes that Japan is headed to as one of the first countries on Earth whose population has begun to shrink. The reason is that 4 years after World War II, Japan had to cut off its baby boom. You may recall that it started that world in the first place by invading Manchuria because its rapidly growing population needed more room. And Germany, of course, invaded Poland for much the same reason. Now, when the war ended, Japanese soldiers went home, and like ours, they took up with their wives where they had left off. And Japan's wartime population of 72 million soon spurted to 83 million. But having lost, Japan's economy was wrecked, and people were starving. In 1949, in an emergency measure, Japan legalized abortion. This was before most contraception. And millions of Japanese women partook lest they have more babies die of hunger. So today, as a large aged population preceding those truncated baby boomers starts to die off, there's a much smaller generation to replace them. Add to that high education and the low fertility that naturally follows, and just past the middle of the century, Japan will be back to its 1945 population. And many Japanese economists are terrified. But Akihiko Matsutani, who's not a radical, but an economist at a major policy institute, sees it as an opportunity. When I met him, Japan had just compounded its shrinkage by losing its most fertile fruit-growing area, Fukushima, and all its nuclear power. Matsutani envisions a gradual realignment away from heavy exporting industries in big port cities that are crowded to a dispersed economy of lighter industries distributed across an agricultural landscape that younger people are starting to return to as empty homes vacated by that last dying overgrown generation are coming available for cheap. Lifestyle, he predicts, will actually improve. Wages won't drop because laborers will be fewer and therefore more valuable, but hours will also be fewer as demand shrinks with population. Prosperity will be redefined to mean having more leisure time to enjoy, rather than being able to afford more consumer toys to occupy far too few hours. So this is not a bad vision of a workable future, though most economists can't imagine it, because to them the definition of economic health is perpetual growth. So while I was there, I was asked by a well-known Japanese business magazine if I thought people were being hysterical to demand an end to nuclear power in the wake of the Fukushima tragedy. Well, given that all your nuclear plants are in seismic zones or on seacoast exposed to typhoons and tsunamis, I answered, I wouldn't call it hysteria. But people will suffer even more if productivity drops. Isn't it hysterical not to take that into account? The interviewer countered. And over the next half hour, he kept rephrasing his question, hoping for a more satisfying response, until during his fourth try, the coffee shop where we sat shook as a tremor struck central Tokyo, rendering my reply unnecessary. In that same magazine, reports now plans to rebuild all the fishing ports destroyed by the tsunami, even though Matsutani tries to remind them that it'll take up to 20 years to do that, and by then only a quarter of the fishermen will still be alive, so 3/4 of the port facilities won't even be necessary. But so far, nobody seems to be thinking about anything beyond this year's contracts, not what their world will need in 20 years. The late economist Julian Simon, who was known for preaching that human ingenuity ensured that resources would never run out, famously won a 1980 bet with Paul Ehrlich that the prices of 5 commodity metals wouldn't rise due to growing scarcity over the coming decade. As The Economist later reported, by the way, in subsequent decades, Ehrlich would have won, yet their bet is still often cited to discredit his warnings. Also, Simon refused to bet that Ehrlich proposed on 5 environmental factors, including global temperature, crop yields, and human sperm counts. In 1994, Simon, ever the cornucopian, declared, "We have the technology to feed, clothe, supply energy to an ever-growing population for the next 7 billion years." Well, with world population then growing by 1.4% annually, Paul and Ann Ehrlich checked his math and responded, well, that was unlikely, because at current rates, within 6,000 years, human population would equal the mass of the universe. Now, otherwise intelligent people spout such nonsense because humans have never had to think about limits before. We're not used to it. Economists warn that if population ever stopped growing, there will be too few laborers paying into pension funds to support too many old people. For a generation or two, they may be right, until, like in Japan, the generations start to come back into balance. But until that happens, we're going to have to adjust. I never said this is going to be simple, but nothing in the 21st century will be. But I can think of a lot of things that my country has blown money on in recent decades, such as those parties we threw in Iraq and Afghanistan, that could be better spent by helping to care for senior citizens. So, look, here's the bottom line. If we keep on the way we're going and growing, we're going to add 2.5 billion more people in the next 35 years. Because we've already used up the best lands and the cheapest energy sources, they're going to have a much bigger and dirtier impact than the last 2.5 billion. And yes, I know that population increase is mainly among the world's poor who don't pack anywhere near as much of an environmental wallop as we do. And that by some measurements, the richest fifth of the world's people consume 66 times as much as the poorest fifth. But our numbers have reached a point where essentially we have redefined the concept of original sin. From the instant we're born, even the humblest among us compounds the world's mounting problems by needing food, firewood, and a roof for starters. Literally, we're all exhaling CO2 and pushing other species over the edge. The world's masses may be poor, but more of them are living in cities where they somehow manage to get cell phones. And whether they've pirated the power or not, they're plugging in their chargers every night, like you and me. Nevertheless, it's true that we, the comparatively affluent, are many orders of magnitude worse. If we multiply our numbers by the amount we consume, it turns out that you and I are sitting in the most overpopulated country on earth. So this means across the board. The reason that I wrote this book was not to ask if we can feed the 11 billion we're headed to, but whether we're already too many. And if so, what can we do about that? Because every species in the history of biology that exceeds the limits of its resource space suffers a population crash, sometimes even a fatal one. I sincerely doubt that we're going to make it to 11 billion. One way or another, our population's coming down. Either we manage it gracefully or nature's going to do it for us. And it's not going to be so pretty. Now here's the good news. We can fix this and give a serious respite to our precious environment without which we cannot live for less money each year than my government was spending our tax dollars on in a month in Iraq and Afghanistan. That amount, about $8.5 billion annually, would let us provide contraception for everyone on earth who wants it. In this book, I accompany the people who make contraceptives available in places like Uganda, Thailand, and Pakistan, where women desperately want and need them. I was staggered to learn how few the donors are, mainly a few Western governments and mainly 4 private foundations, and how fragile the supply lines are. If a shipment of birth control pills or Depo-Provera injections don't arrive, or the truck breaks down or gets hijacked, or they disappear from the warehouse, as you women well know, miss one crucial dose and all those careful efforts are for naught. The U.S. is the biggest donor of all. But if someone else had won the last presidential election, as Romney and Ryan assured their base, much of that crucial largesse would have been canceled. Now here's what could happen if we fail to provide it. Without contraception reaching those women in the developing world, our ranks would expand by 1 million more hungry people, not every 4.5 days, but every 2.5 days. 7 more Beijings a year instead of the 4 that we're already adding. Put another way, forget all those UN projections that we take for granted, because just a half a child more per woman, and we'd be headed not to 11 billion, but to 16 billion by the end of this century. On the other hand, if we provide contraception for all, and I do discuss in here promising new and far simpler male contraceptives that are coming ready, anyhow, with contraception available for all, we'd be back down to 6 billion, well on our way to a sustainable future for our species, which each decade will be easier, not harder to feed. Does this sound far-fetched? I fear it's a lot easier than coming up with zero-emission energy. We've been trying to tap free sunlight at all for years, and we're still nowhere near capable of running all of our industries and our vehicles, our cities, our Indias, and our Chinas on it. Nor do we know how to do something even more magical, convince everybody to consume less. By the time that happens, if ever, I think our world will be long trashed. This, however, is technology that we already have, nothing requiring some enormous leap. As one of our most brilliant physicists, Carnegie's Ken Caldeira, once told me, if we built a 900 megawatt zero-emission plant every day for the next 50 years, we still couldn't keep up with demand, and we still don't even know how to build one. But combine contraception with education for females, and we'll tap one of the richest human resources of all. The same Vietnamese Demographic Institute I mentioned earlier recently calculated that if female education were universally available, there would be 1 billion fewer of us, not by the end, but by the middle of this century. And think how all those educated women would help those feared labor shortages during a demographic transition back to sanity. At one point in Countdown, I quote former World Bank economist Herman Daly on designing an economy that can prosper without perpetual growth, which one day we must find because we live on a planet that doesn't grow. The switch to sustainable economy, he wrote in Scientific American, would entail an enormous change of heart and mind by economists, politicians, and voters. One might be tempted to declare that such a project would be impossible. But the alternative to a sustainable economy, an ever-growing economy, is biophysically impossible. So in choosing between tackling a political impossibility or a biophysical impossibility, I judge the latter to be the more impossible and take my chances with the former. What my research for Countdown has led me to conclude that we need to do is easier than that, because the majority of places and people on Earth are already doing it. More than half the countries in the world are at, near, or below replacement rate. Let's do whatever it takes to help bring the rest there too. And then by making the means available so everyone can choose the numbers they want, gradually down towards a truly sustainable number, rather than ask how we're going to do the impossible, feed them all, when we can't even feed the ones we have without messing up our planet even more. Thank you.